Hey y'all, Leela with Miss Kreations. Welcome back to my channel. And today's tutorial, I will be showing you how I created this Snowflake Peekaboo Distress Tumbler. Like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including some direct links and coupon codes. And don't forget to find me on all of my socials, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and now I'm on Lemon8. And as a reminder, I do have a website where you can shop all of my tumblers that are currently available, and I also sell UV DTF decals and 16-ounce cup wraps. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. I am using a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I start by prepping my tumbler with a 180 grit sanding block. I use anywhere between a 60 grit and 180 grit sanding block when I prep my tumblers. Once I'm finished sanding my tumbler, I wipe my tumbler down with 91% alcohol. That little alcohol bottle I will have linked in my description below. I know a lot of times people ask me where I purchased that from. I just get it from Amazon. It's a little makeup dispenser bottle and it's super cheap. So you can spray paint your tumbler after you're finished prepping it, but I wanted to use my Adhesive Apothecary paint. This is a paint primer and adhesive. I'm actually going to do 2 coats of this paint on my tumbler, but like I said, if you want to just paint this white, you can, but it was really cold in Florida, so I didn't want to go outside. I use a Wet n Wild makeup brush to apply all of my paints. I really like how the makeup brush applies these paints to my tumblers. I will also have these makeup brushes linked in my description below. I first put a thin coat of this white as the first base. The reason why I'm doing 2 coats is because it is white, so white tends to be more transparent than other colors. I let this dry for about 30 minutes and then I move on to my second coat. And for this coat, I will be adding 3 glitters to this tumbler from Glitter Heart Co. I'm adding Winter Frost, Melon-tini, and Skylight. Looking back at this tumbler, you really do not need 3 of these colors. I don't know what I was thinking, but you know, sometimes you have a vision in your head for a tumbler, and then as you're going through your tumbler, the vision changes. So if you have 1 color on hand, like a nice winter blue or a nice white on hand, I would just go back and just apply 1 color to this tumbler instead of doing this 3 ombre for no reason. You'll see at the end. So this is my second coat of my Adhesive Apothecary. Again, this is a paint primer and adhesive. I'm applying these paints all over the tumbler. Once I finish applying the paints, I go in with my colors, and I always add the colors to the top and the bottom because the top and the bottom of the tumblers, it always tends to dry first. And then I go in with my second and third color. This is such a pretty ombre. I really wish that I'm gonna remember this and do this for another cup, but I just love this nice winterish ombre. Once I was finished applying my glitters to the tumbler, I seal my tumbler with my Krylon Crystal Clear acrylic coating. I spray 2 generous coats. Again, this product will be linked in my description below. I let this dry for about 30 minutes or so, and then I'm going to move on with my coats of epoxy. Everybody knows I use Flynn Sisters Supply Shop epoxy, and since this is a 20-ounce tumbler and I did apply my glitter to this tumbler, I times 20 by 2, which is 40 mLs of epoxy, so that's how much epoxy I am placing on this tumbler. I do have a 10% coat off with Flynn Sisters Supply Shop epoxy as well if you want to try their epoxy, and she does have smaller bottles for y'all to try. I used my Fast Set epoxy for this step because I was trying to hurry up and do this tumbler, but if you notice, I have 3 sets of nails in this tumbler, my fingernails. So I started this tumbler back in October, and it is almost January when I'm posting this video, so this tumbler took so long to do. I don't know why I did Fast Set, but just know you can use Fast Set or regular set epoxy. I let that tumbler spin on the cup turner, I let it cure, and then I'm going in with my X-Acto knife. Once my tumbler is cured, I'm just removing any of that excess epoxy that may have been cured on the rim. And then once I'm finished with X-Acto knifing the rim, I go in with a sanding block and I sand very lightly around my tumbler. I am using a 180 grit sanding block for the rim, and I'm exposing the tiniest bit of stainless steel, so whenever you're finished epoxying, you have a nice seal at the very top. Then I take a 220 grit sanding block and I sand lightly around the entire tumbler, getting rid of any of the bumps that may have been placed on the tumbler with the epoxy or any glitter pieces that might have been poking up. After sanding, I wiped my tumbler down with 91% alcohol. I noticed my tumbler was still a little uneven and bumpy, so I wanted to put another coat of epoxy after I finished cleaning it off. So I went in with my second coat of epoxy and I did a thinner coat again just to make sure this tumbler was even. I did 15 mLs of epoxy, that's 7.5 mLs part A and 7.5 mLs part B, totaling 15 mLs of epoxy. If your tumbler was smooth after the first application of epoxy, you do not have to do this part. The only reason why I'm doing this is so my tumbler will be nice and smooth with no glitter pieces sticking up. I let this tumbler spin on the cup turner, I let the epoxy cure on the tumbler, and once it was finished curing, I went back in with my X-Acto knife to clean up the rim of my tumbler, and then I sanded it lightly. Again, the rim, and then I sanded around the tumbler lightly, and then I wiped the tumbler down with my 91% alcohol. I used a 180 grit sanding block for this step because we had 2 layers of epoxy on this tumbler, so I didn't have to worry about sanding away that glitter that's been placed underneath that epoxy. Now that I have a nice smooth tumbler, I am moving on to my decals. So I used Cricut Design Space and I did an offset for my snowflakes. My Snowflake files will be listed in my description below. I believe I use CreativeFabrica, but you can go to Cricut Design Space and type in snowflakes, and there are plenty of free snowflakes that are available on Cricut Design Space. I no longer use the premium Cricut Design Space, so I'm pretty sure that these snowflakes were free. So my white decal that you saw me peel up before, that was the offset. So if you are not familiar with offsetting your vinyl, or you don't use Cricut Design Space, it's kind of like a shadow behind the design. So these snowflakes are the actual design, and the white pieces that you see below, these are actually like the shadow. So this is what's going to create that peekaboo effect, and I use about 0.06 of my offsets whenever I typically do these types of designs. So I'm now cutting my designs down, and I'm going to place the offsets on the tumbler first, and then we will worry about the actual snowflakes at the end. I use 631 or temporary vinyl for my offset placement. You can use any color because these are just going to act as like a template for now. So we will be removing these snowflakes at the end. So just keep that in mind. If you are using permanent vinyl, it's going to be a lot tougher to remove the vinyl from your tumblers than if you were using temporary vinyl. I always purchase a 5 feet roll of 631 white vinyl, and I always use that for my offsets or the templates that I use. I will have that roll linked in my description below, and it is very cheap. It's like $5 if that. While you're placing your decals on the tumbler, you want to make sure you are pressing down your decals because the next step will be spray painting this tumbler. So since I am spray painting my tumbler, I always place my painter's tape inside of my tumbler just so that overspray doesn't get inside, just to make the cleanup process a lot easier. And then I went outside and I sprayed my tumbler white. I do have the white matte on hand, but if I had gloss or satin, I would have spray painted my tumbler with that. It does not matter the finish of spray paint that you use. So if you notice, I really didn't spray paint the top and the bottom of the tumbler. I focused more on the middle of the tumbler because the top and the bottom is where I will be distressing the tumbler most. I start by taking 100% acetone. I will have that linked in my description below, and I start distressing the bottom and the top just to make the overall cleanup process easier, and you'll see what I'm talking about when I start adding other inks. Once I was finished with that, I went in with some Tim Holtz. I am using Slate, Gunmetal, and Silver, and I'm also using black from Pinata. This is alcohol inks, and I'm going to use these for kind of that wood grain distress look. And I do apply these with a chip brush. I've used the same chip brush for about 5 or 6 years for my grays. And all you do is you apply your inks to the tumbler and you brush in a up and a down motion. Make sure you're being as straight as possible whenever you're moving your paintbrush, because if it is a little curved for me, I don't know, it kind of throws me off some. And my spray paint is completely dried, by the way. Make sure your spray paint is dry. So as I was applying my inks to the tumbler, I noticed that I really liked the gunmetal and the silver color the most. So those are the two colors that I used the most. And then I added a little bit of black in areas just to give it some dimension. And then once my inks were applied to the tumbler, I went in with a 91% alcohol and I wiped away some of the inks. So I started with my 100% acetone first to wipe away the spray paint. Once that spray paint was wiped away, then I applied my alcohol inks. Then I went in with my 91% alcohol. So I thought that was a lot easier. You only need 91% alcohol to remove your alcohol inks. You don't need something as strong as the 100% acetone. So just keep that in mind. Whenever you distress a tumbler, try not to overthink it. Sometimes it's easier to distress your tumbler a little bit, walk away from it, and then distress it more, because sometimes, at least for me, I overanalyze the distressing. But just remember that it's distressed and it's not supposed to look perfect. It's supposed to look worn and old and grungy. So just keep that in mind. So once I was finished doing most of this distressing, I went in with some Q-tips and I cleaned up the little areas, because sometimes the alcohol will make these little bubbles around the tumbler, like splash marks. So I wanted to make sure that I removed those, and then I removed any ink that was on the glitter part. Everybody does their distressing differently, so just have fun with your distressing. You can place a dry paper towel and just rub it around the alcohol inks, and you can distress it that way and have more glitter peeking through. You can use a rag, just make sure it's a brand new rag with no other oils. You can, like what you see here, I have my paper towels, and what I do is I dampen my paper towel with my 91% alcohol, and sometimes I'll rub up and down on the tumbler, and that will remove some of the alcohol inks kind of. But really just don't overanalyze this part. I like the layering, and then to go and clean up the rest of the distressing, I always like to go in with that Q-tip. I really think it helps a lot and doesn't make it look as homemade. Does that make sense? Okay, so I think you get the point of how to distress a tumbler. Just take your time with this. Make sure you're wearing gloves, protecting those new painted fingernails. And once I'm finished with this, I'll show you the next step. Once your tumbler is distressed, you're nice and happy with it. Now we are going to remove those decals. I always use a weeding tool and I remove the decals very slowly. You want to make sure you are not scratching the tumbler. Now this is the distress look, so if you do scratch a tumbler a little bit in this case, it might be okay, but I'm always super careful when I remove these decals, and I'm always wearing gloves and just taking my time with this, because you don't want to scrape the tumbler or scratch it and just ruin your look overall. And if you notice in some of the areas that I have the snowflakes on the top and the bottom, I did a half distress, so those snowflakes are kind of hanging off in the glitter part, and then half of it's in the distress part. I really like that about the tumbler, and like I always tell y'all, these tumblers are made for inspiration. So make your tumbler however you want to make it, and I know whatever you create is going to be beautiful. And once my offset decals were removed, I went in with my decals, my actual snowflakes, and I applied those in the areas that were bare. So now you kind of see the concept, and I wanted to use holographic silver and holographic blue to go along with the whole icy winter theme of this tumbler. I don't know where I bought this vinyl from, but by the time I do my description, I will find out for y'all, and it will be linked in my description below so y'all can purchase it. And my snowflake sizes, they range from the smallest being about 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and the largest snowflakes is about 2 inches by 2 inches. Really just play around with the sizes. I really never overthink the sizes. I always do those ranges, and if the 2 inch or the 1/2 inch decals were too big or small, I would have just not placed them on this tumbler and I would have saved them for another project. And you can see here, I am using my X-Acto knife to cut that vinyl. That's very important because when you seal your tumbler in with your epoxy coats, you don't want that vinyl at the very top of your tumbler, or you won't be able to get that nice seal at the end. And for the bottom of the bottom of the tumbler, I just applied 3 white decals just to have a little bit of a pop on the bottom. Once all of my decals were added to the tumbler, I went in with my CC DIY Quick Coat. This is a urethane sealer. It will be linked in my description below. I have used this sealer my entire tumbler crafting career, and I typically just apply these over my vinyl pieces, but when I was finished applying it on my vinyl pieces, I thought, why don't I just apply this over my alcohol inks as well? So I basically just sealed the inks in, and I also sealed the vinyl in. I apply this over all of my vinyl pieces so my vinyl doesn't lift when I epoxy, and this way, sealing the alcohol inks, I didn't have to wait 24 hours before epoxying, because I typically wait to let this dry 24 hours before applying my coat of epoxy over inks, because the inks tend to fade when you apply your epoxy. And once that coat of urethane sealer was dried on the tumbler, I went in with 2 coats of epoxy. So I did 10 mLs of epoxy for each coat. So 5 mLs part A and 5 mLs part B, totaling 10 mLs of epoxy. I always like to do 2 thinner coats for my final coats, then 1 thicker coat, just so I can have a nice even tumbler. And if those 2 final coats weren't thick enough for y'all, you can always go in with a 3rd coat, or just go in with like 15 mLs of epoxy for each coat. I let those coats of epoxy cure, and then I went in with my final cleanup process. I take my X-Acto knife and I X-Acto knife all of the excess epoxy that may have been placed on the tumbler, and then I take my 180 grit sanding block and I sand very lightly on some areas that might need sanding. I clean out my tumbler with some Dawn dish soap, and my tumbler is completely finished, ready to go. And now that you see the final tumbler, I hope you understand that I really didn't need those 3 glitters, but I had a different vision in mind in the beginning. But if you use 1 glitter, it would be plenty enough. I know this video is after Christmas, but it's still winter and it's still a winter wonderland in parts of the world, so I thought this would do really well still. And this is a really fun tumbler, and it has so many different possibilities and so many different colors you can do with this tumbler, so I'm really glad that I was able to finally finish it. So if you made it to this very last part of the video, thank you. And thank you to everybody who has liked, shared, watched, just supported my channel and all of my socials throughout the last year. I really do appreciate it. I am very grateful. I would not be making these videos without the continuous amount of love and support that I always have received, especially from YouTube. You guys have always been my biggest support and my biggest fans, and you guys have always showed me love. So thank you so much. I hope you guys have a happy new year, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more Tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next year. Bye!